Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. And today we will be talking about the Bible and slavery, and as to whether or not the Bible supports it. Now this is a very popular topic. It even has its own Wikipedia page. Now there are a lot of liberal and modern scholars, as well as secular scholars, who hold that slavery in the Bible is absolutely condoned. And not only is it condoned, but it inspired American slavery in the South. Today, we're going to be dissecting as to whether or not this is true. As a Christian, a Catholic to be very specific, I personally do not hold to the view that this is representing slavery. However, I will differ from how most Christians do in their apologetics. The simple apologetics of most Christians is to explain that this was indentured servitude, and that it was only for a short amount of time, and that they were servants. However, as Leviticus 25:44-46 says, you may buy your female and male slaves from whom you have, you may buy them from the nations around you, and you may also buy from the strangers who sojourn with you. The verses that refer to the indentured servants refer to the Hebrews, such as the following verses before it, which is Leviticus 25:39-43, which clearly instate that the indentured servants are indeed Hebrews. The apologetics today will not seek to prove that these were indentured servants, but rather that they were not chattel slaves, as it was in the American South. A good example of this is in the next verse I will show you, where very clearly states in Leviticus 19:34, you shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you. Now, a stranger or sojourner would most likely come to Israel for political or religious reasonings. If that is the case, then we must accept the fact that they would have been treated the same. Now, the foreigner is indeed mentioned in the former verse, which is Leviticus 25:44. The foreigner would be living in the land, but if he must be treated the same, then we must indeed apply the fact that it must be the case that they were also indentured servitude. Now, issue lies mainly with the fact that servitude is not referred to as temporary in the verse before. It is referred to as permanent. However, elsewhere in the Bible, it clearly states that if a slave wants to stay with his master, then he is free to do so. And if the foreigner is to be treated the same as the Hebrew, then we must also admit that he can do the same, and he can indeed permanently stay. This is very clear in the biblical text. If he is to be treated as the native among them, then indeed he must be an indentured servant, and he must be freed in the year of Jubilee. This is a very simple case, and I don't think much needs to be said on the matter. As long as we accept the fact that this stranger needs to be treated the same, then we must admit that by all means, he must indeed be just an indentured servant. Other verses elsewhere say that you shall not oppress said sojourner. So even this indentured servant must be treated the same. In fact, as it says beforehand, though you cannot oppress your fellow Israelite, it says you also may not oppress the sojourner, meaning yet again that these two must be treated the same. Main issue lies with the fact that the verse, Leviticus 25:44, clearly says two different types of slaves, the foreigner, as well as from the nations among you. If we are to take it from the nations among you, then we must also clearly see that this is a type of transatlantic slave trade that we saw in the Americas. However, we in nowhere in the biblical text see that you must trade them. In fact, we see quite the opposite. As Exodus 21:16 says, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. That is not looking good for the case that there was a slave trade. If there was a slave trade of these nations among them, we must accept that the Israelites would not have been able to participate in it. Because if they did, they would have been naturally sinning against God. Meaning, that the Israelites did not have a slave trade, and therefore it could not have been chattel slavery what they were doing. But if the slaves from the nations among them were not chattel slaves, what type of slaves were they? Well, if we read the New American Standard Bible, another very accurate form of the Bible, we can see that the word male and female slaves from the nations among you is changed to the pagan nations that are around you. Now, if you remember, the Bible clearly says that the Israelites were to banish the Canaanites from the land. So then these pagans must be those they were in war with. It is possible then that less so were they slaves, and rather were they prisoners of war or captives, who were likely, indeed, and indefinitely, not chattel slaves, and therefore could not have been bought and sold. Clear throughout these verses. There's laws about fugitive slaves in the Bible that also clearly say that you cannot return a slave to his master, which is clearly showing that if a slave was to escape, or less so escape, but rather leave, you were not to return him to his master. Of course, among all these things, one particular thing comes about. What about the influence that the Bible had on American slavery? Did it have any? As a matter of fact, no, it didn't. What we actually see is a very simple misunderstanding here. There was indeed a Bible that was given to slaves, but it was not the Bible that we read today. They took out certain parts of Paul, such as the book of Galatians, which contains the verse Galatians 3:28, which would clearly state that you are all one in Christ, no matter what race. Also, they left out completely the story of Exodus. However, they continued to keep the story of Joseph. So clearly, the Bible that they were giving to slaves was not the same Bible that we read today, and therefore could not have been supported said slavery. I could bring up the fact that elsewhere in the Bible, it also says that Hebrew slaves are to be, or could be, kept eternally, which would mean that the same punishment that is given to them can be given elsewhere. This is shown in verses such as Exodus 21, 1-2, which clearly show that if a slave was to be kept permanently, it was his choice. And if we are to apply the logic that all slaves must be treated equally, or rather, people, then we must accept that yet again, this permanence was a choice, and therefore volitional. So to simplify it, the Israelites and those from the pagan nations around them, as slaves, were to be treated the same. They were, if to oppress the other, to be oppressed the same. And, as just presented by me, if they were to be kept permanently, then it would have been completely up to their choice and not against their will, lest they break biblical law. With all that being said, may God bless whoever watches this, and